suicide is a leading cause of death among youth in middle and high-income countries, and deliberate self-harm, so self-inflicted injury, is a common cause of visiting the emergency room. As a physician, I see firsthand the devastating effects on individuals and their families from mental illness. In recent years, there have been a number of investments and programs that have been developed to improve the mental health of children and youth in Ontario. It's important that we study how well we're doing with these programs to ensure that they're working and that they're targeted appropriately. In recent years, we've learned it's important to study the differences over time in mental illness in subgroups of children and youth. Specifically, we want to understand differences by race, by sex, by urban and rural divide, and we also want to understand differences in children and youth and their mental health by their immigrant status. Immigrants in particular may have vulnerabilities when they arrive and settle in Canada, and this may impact on their mental health, specifically their suicide risk and their risk of deliberate self-harm. It's important that we understand differences in this risk between immigrants and non-immigrants, as well as subpopulations of immigrants, for example, refugees and immigrants based on their country of origin. When it comes to suicide, we know there's wide variability in the rates of suicide by country of origin, and immigrants can bring this risk of suicide with them to Canada. In understanding the specific risk factors in immigrant subpopulations, then we can target suicide prevention programs and mental illness programs for children and youth. Over the last few years, researchers at the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences have had the privilege of being able to use data from Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada and link it to healthcare data that we hold. This data is linked through a secure platform and allows us to understand the health of immigrants who arrive in Ontario to better support their health needs. We looked at a cohort of children and youth living in Ontario between 1996 and 2012. Using the immigration data from Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, we were able to identify which children and youth were immigrants versus non-immigrants, as well as understand immigration characteristics about those individuals. We looked at almost 3 million children and youth and studied their risk of suicide over time, as well as the risk of deliberate self-harm over time. What we found is that the risk of suicide and deliberate self-harm in immigrant populations is about a third lower than that of children and youth who have been in Canada for over 10 years or who were born in Canada. What we also found is that the mechanism of suicide and self-harm is different. For example, non-immigrant children are more likely to use lethal means, such as a firearm, to die by suicide, whereas immigrant children and youth are less likely to use such means. Unfortunately, we did not see improvements in rates of suicide in either non-immigrant or immigrant youth in Ontario. This suggests there are opportunities for improving our current suicide prevention strategies to ensure they are more targeted and effective at reducing suicide in youth in Ontario. The finding that suicide and self-harm rates among immigrant children are lower compared with Canadian-born is an important one. It suggests there may be protective factors among immigrant youth that we can learn from and build upon to improve the mental health strategy in Ontario. We also found good news when it comes to deliberate self-harm rates in both immigrant and non-immigrant populations. In particular, we saw very rapid declines in the rates of deliberate self-harm in immigrant populations, which suggests that we're doing a good job with our settlement supports and mental health strategy for this specific population. However, the gains we've seen are not universal. There are still some populations of refugees, in particular those who have been here for 5 to 10 years, who have not experienced the same improvements in deliberate self-harm compared with other immigrant subgroups. This is a group that we need to look at targeted interventions going forward. This study fills an important knowledge gap in understanding the mental health needs of immigrant children and youth in Ontario. It also highlights the value of our partnership with Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada in allowing us to share data and link it to better understand and support the health of Ontarians.